Sien treker chalhan mad. Bien chi gas neer se gwyn. Chalidona gomien shen la. Ta kamaradi shinte.
One of the few uplifting aspects of the Great Famine is the fact that so many people who had no association with Ireland wanted to help the poor suffering in the country. And one of those men is James Hack Tuke. James Hack Tuke was born in Yorkshire in England in 1819. Like many Quakers, he wanted to help. The Quaker group in Ireland were relatively small, but they were amongst the first to come to the aid of the starving Irish. In November 1846, a committee was formed in Dublin to oversee the efforts of Quakers throughout Ireland in giving relief. A number of Quakers from England asked if they could help, and one of those Quakers was James Hack Tuke, then only aged 26. And he came to Ireland, and like Shaletsky, he chose to locate himself in one of the remotest, poorest parts of the country. He headed over to County Mayo, to the remote Belmullet Erris Peninsula, where people were suffering and dying in large numbers. And there, like other Quakers, he helped to establish soup kitchens, which were a very practical way of giving immediate relief to the starving poor. Also, just as importantly, he provided eyewitness accounts of what he saw. And these were sent back to the Quakers in Dublin, who in turn put them in newspapers throughout the world. And his eyewitness accounts are really important in countering British propaganda that said the suffering had been exaggerated. So in a number of ways, he provided very important service. He, like many Quakers, was extremely critical of the landlords in the west of Ireland. One landlord was so angry he said that if he ever met Tuke, he would shoot him on sight. But Tuke was not deterred, and he revisited Ireland a number of times during the Great Famine. At one point, Tuke had to return to England to look after the family business in Yorkshire. But he realised that a great number of emigrants were coming to England without any resources. So he set up a hospital in his hometown. And one day, while working in the hospital, he himself caught what was called Irish fever. He did recover, but his health was impaired. What is further remarkable about the Tuke story is, like so many, he never forgot the suffering he had witnessed. And in 1879 to 82, the so-called forgotten famine, he returned to Ireland. He realised he'd learnt lessons during the Great Hunger, and one of the lessons was that people needed immediate relief. He was horrified to see that in the intervening 30 years, so little had changed in the west of Ireland. People were still dependent on potatoes and living in overcrowded conditions. And so he felt an immediate solution would be to help people emigrate. And so he went to America and to Canada, and he found locations where people were needed to work. And he worked with the local authorities to set up an emigration scheme that was well thought out. People who chose to go on this scheme were given money, were given clothing, were sent to locations where they actually had family or friends and where jobs were available. And 10,000 people emigrated as a result of this emigration scheme.
But his connection with Ireland really takes off in 1880, when in February of 1880 he's sent by the Society of Friends during what we call the Forgotten Famine of 1879 to 82. This was when the potato crop once again failed and over 1 million people were on the verge of total destitution and starvation. But what he actually does is he travels to the exact same locations that he'd been in 1847. And what he realises is that conditions in 1880 had not improved to any great extent compared to 1847. Population was increasing in places like Connemara, West Mayo. that the pre-famine conditions were still there in terms of the subdivision of holdings, the practices such as rundale. And what this leads to is him writing a series of pamphlets in 1880 in relation to what can be done to relieve the distress that's taking place and have long-term benefits. And he comes up with the idea that assisted immigration and bringing families to North America is a solution. And it has two reasons. Firstly, it will leave land so that farms can be expanded in the west of Ireland when the families actually leave. And secondly, it will also lead to a process of chain migration, because once these families establish themselves in North America, what they can do then is they can provide passage for other friends and family members back in the west of Ireland, which actually does take place in the second half of the 1880s when large numbers are sending money back. What happens as well is that they brought with them stories from home that they passed on to their children and to other family members. But they also brought with them songs.
Is Misha Deirdre Ní Chonghaile. I'm a musician and a scholar researching Irish traditional music and song. I work a lot with archives of music, and I've written a book about the collecting of music in Ireland. One of the archives that I work with dates from the 19th and early 20th centuries, and it consists of 10 boxes of manuscript material transcribed in Pennsylvania. There are over 1,200 sean-nós songs surviving in these manuscripts, and up to 20 versions of some of those songs, which were sung by around 450 singers who had emigrated from Ireland, from counties all along the western seaboard, from Donegal down to Kerry. The two collectors who created this collection are the Reverend Daniel J. Murphy from Kilmactyghe, County Sligo, and J.J. Lyons from Glenamaddy in County Galway. It would have been quite rare for people to have been literate in the Irish language in the late 19th century, prior to the establishment of the Gaelic League. So it is an incredibly valuable resource, and a rare one at that, to have such a collection at that scale, and also the level of detail that's provided. Among the manuscripts, there's a collection of songs, over 30 of them, sung by a couple from Erris in northwest Mayo, William Judge and Sarah Gallagher, who emigrated via the Tuke scheme in 1883 to Centralia in northeastern Pennsylvania in the Anthracite Hills, and later lived in Philadelphia. Morning to Mayo to Ní Bheidwad Beo Bannas Fivi Norong. We are so fortunate to have in the Murphy collection insight into the emotional lives of the 450 emigrant singers who were in Pennsylvania and were able to share their songs with Murphy and Lyons. The fragility of the paper belies the vitality and energy of those performances, those lives, and it calls to mind Moya Cannon's poem Carrying the Songs, in which she writes, "Songs were their soul's currency, the pure metal of their hearts."
Today, the people who are descended from the original emigrants thank Tuke. They remember him, they've come together, largely due to the work being done in Belmullart by the remarkable Rosemary Geraghty.
I'm a Tuke descendant, and I've been fascinated since learning about my history, my family's history, to learn more about what occurred, what Mr. Tuke did for my family and other descendants. My great-grandfather He was part of the Tuke assisted immigration. He left on May 25th, 1883 on the SS Austrian. His parents were both 30 years old. My grandfather, Martin Henry Kennedy, was 8. He was the oldest of the 4 siblings that came along. He had a younger brother, Patrick, a sister. Patrick was 6, Mary was 4, and he had a sister, Sabina, 2. They left and they landed in Boston, and I believe they arrived on June 7th of 1883. And I've looked into research and I have been able to find, obviously, the passenger, the manifest of the ship. And I know that everyone in the Kennedy family arrived alive. But from that time, I have no knowledge of what happened to what would be my great aunt Sabina, who was 2. There's no record of her. She does not appear in any of the censuses that were taken. And so she remains a mystery to me, but I'm not giving up on her. I want to continue to see what I can do to find her if possible. Once they arrived in Boston, they took a train to western Wisconsin. Wisconsin is a farming country, and I've been told, even by my father, that a lot of it resembles Ireland in the fact that it's rocky land. And so his family moved to Minnesota with essentially the neighbors that they left with on the expedition on the SS Austrian. There's all their neighbors from Belmullet there, actually the town of Cross. So my grandfather and my father then lived there. My grandfather actually married a woman of German descent who lived on the other side, in the eastern area of Wisconsin. My grandfather and his neighbors settled in 2 towns. They named them one Erin Prairie, and the other town was named Emerald. So you know that they were very Irish towns. I was able to go to visit where my grandfather and my great-grandparents were born in Belmullet. And so my great-grandfather and my grandfather were born in Cross, and my great-grandmother was born in Binghamstown, which the 2 towns are very near to one another. I was very fortunate to visit Ireland in 2014, and I met my 3rd cousin, Mary Kennedy Carolyn, who greeted me very warmly and introduced me to her family and welcomed me. She took me to some cemeteries. She took me to the little village of Cross to see where my family lived. I was able to visit several heritage centers while I was there. To my surprise and delight, one of the women who runs one of the centers there had sent me an email about 2 weeks before I visited and said, "When you come, we're going to have a Kennedy family reunion for you." And I was shocked because, 5 months ago, I didn't even know I had Kennedy relatives still alive in Ireland. And when I got to this hall to see this reunion, there were about 26 people that showed up. And it was very emotional for me, and it still is for me to talk about it sometimes, but it just showed that, even though I go back several generations, I just feel a kindredship to my family and to really where I came from. And when I started reading about Mr. Tuke and all that he did for us, it makes me very touched that he cared enough. I mean, here's an Englishman coming to the rescue of starving Irish people. And I will say this, and I've said this in social media, that if it wasn't for James Hack Tuke, I really don't think my family would have survived what was going on back then. How anyone actually made it out alive and was able to survive is pretty miraculous.
I had become aware of the Tuke Emigration Scheme and its importance for County Mayo, in particular Belmullet and Achill Island and other communities ringing Blacksod Bay, through the work of Rosemary Garrity and her website blacksoddbayimmigration.ie. It's not her personal website, of course, but the heritage center that she's a part of, and how meeting her and becoming aware of the website, which has a searchable database and a way to share information about what possibly might have happened to these passengers. I became became aware of the significance of the Tuke Emigration Scheme for Cleveland, Ohio. I have some people in my extended Irish immigrant family group who were part of the scheme, and I found their passenger records for the first time through finding them on the database on blacksideemigration.ie. And when I found them, that started clicking in with me that other people that I'd been researching as part of my work with the Irish American Archive Society and about the Irish and the history of Cleveland, I had become aware that there did seem to be significant people who came to Cleveland in the 1880s. And I began to look up more and more people on the site and find a certain number of them, and began to think that there was a real significance or connection there.
My name is Lenora Kenny Daniel. We're here at the Great Famine Roadshow at Quinnipiac University.
And I'm Ethan Daniel, her son.
And we are both descendants of the Tuke emigration, the assisted immigration from Balmullet. So my grandmother came at 8 and she went to upstate Pennsylvania. The men were coal miners. She eventually ended up as a servant with wealthy families in outside of Philadelphia. I don't know what age that would have been. She met my grandfather, who had been a coal miner in Pennsylvania. They all moved down to Philadelphia. I don't know exactly, did they meet and marry in upstate Pennsylvania, or did they marry in Philadelphia, or did she say, I've been living in Philly, I'm not going back to the mountains in the coal mining. He was a policeman. He lied about his age. He was a little older at the time, but it was a good job, so it was worth the lie. And they had 7 children, one of them being my father. And
hi, my name is Richard Rook. I'm speaking to you from the Great Famine Voices Roadshow at Quinnipiac University in Connecticut. And I am a Tuke Emigration Descendant. My family in Ireland were the Tukers, T-O-G-H-E-R-S. It became anglicized to Tucker when they got to the United States. My family left in April 1883 on the SS Phoenician and arrived in Boston about 10 days later. They had been set up with jobs not too far from where we are today, in Willimantic, Connecticut, North Grosvenor, Connecticut, at textile mills, courtesy of James Tuke. And as I researched my family, I became aware of the fact that working in the textile mills was a pretty tough life. Southern New England was in the process of becoming really the textile capital of the world. Many of the emigrants from all over Europe came to work in our textile mills, including my family. But it was rotten, brutal work. It was 15-hour days, 6, sometimes 7 days a week, oppressive heat, breathing terrible fumes. My great-grandfather, his job description in a textile mill, and this was one of the better textile mills, was loom fixer and ratter. I had a pretty good idea what a loom fixer was, but I didn't know what a ratter was, so I did some research. And this gave me an idea of the better life that they had come to, how tough that life could be. When a rat got caught, and this was not uncommon, when a rat got caught in the the looms, they didn't want to shut them down because time is money and production is money. So they slowed the machine down to almost, but not quite, a stop. And people like my grandfather and his father would reach into the machine and pull out the rat because they didn't want the rat's blood on the very valuable textile. Okay, that's a good way to lose a hand, a wrist. There's no urgent care centers, and as a result, I realized that while I had a lot of, my family was big when it came over here, not many of them lived to adulthood or past early adulthood. They all died of respiratory diseases. pneumonia, tuberculosis. You worked in the textile mills, you died young of respiratory diseases. So as a result of that, while their family was very large, my great-grandfather was one of 13, they only produced 23 grandchildren. Those 13 kids only produced 23 grandchildren, and 11 of those 23 grandchildren never lived to adulthood.
The lady that found us was Leslie Thomas, and her great-grandparents had travelled from Camas and Annachvan, which is in South Connemara, to the St. Paul area. Like so many, she had no idea where her family were from, just Connemara. And she went through the ship's manifests that were online and went, the names, yes, the ages, yes, I wonder could this be our family? So she'd sent the email, and I went through our research from this side, and over many emails over and back, we discovered, yes, this was her family, and she was overjoyed. And I was so happy to have been a part of her finding this is where they're from. Because here in Ireland, we know where we're from, we know our roots, but it means the world, absolute world, to anybody from any part of the world, to find their little spot, their place in the world, and it's special. So she was planning a trip to Ireland for the following June, Leslie, and she was going to Dublin and Cork, and I convinced her to come to Connemara. So she came here, and when we met up, she stayed in a local B&B, and we did a little road trip out Connemara. So we went to Camas, Annachvan, up and down the back roads. She just kept getting out and looking at the stone walls and like wondering, would her family have walked these roads? And we tried to retrace as much as we could of where they would have been. Like, obviously some roads weren't there back then, but we enjoyed the day. So she went back to the States, back to St. Paul, so happy.
My name is Geraldine Mills, and I am a descendant of one of the emigrants that went to America as part of the Tuke scheme. I'm here in Gerard Courthouse to talk about my story. Growing up, I knew very little about my maternal great-grandparents, other that they went to America and came back, and a child died along the way. And then we had to go, of course, and find out more about Mr. Tuke, whom up until now we had never heard of. And that opened up a whole other world as well for us as I researched his story and discovered what he had done for almost 10,000 people in the west of Ireland. Philip and Mary Heverin, our great-grandparents, left Belmullet in North Mayo on the 22nd of June 1883 as part of the Tuke scheme. They left from Ely Bay. There were 10 families that went from Dulac, that small area where my great-grandfather came from. 8 of them actually had been evicted. The documentation tells us that our great-grandfather gave the land back to the landlord, and they left. I know from reports of other ships that went, people seemed to be very happy to go because it was a whole family that was going. They weren't being separated in the going. They arrived in Boston on the 4th of July 1883, and it was quite an auspicious day for them to arrive in America with all the celebrations that would have been going on for the 4th of July. Documentation tells us that they were ticketed to Warren, Rhode Island, where work was arranged for my great-grandfather. 3 families from Mayo actually went to Warren with them, because I believe Tuke didn't believe in sending whole loads of people to the one area, so 3 families went. My great-grandfather was given work in the Warren Manufacturing Company, a cotton mills. The work in the mill, I believe, would have been quite taxing, quite difficult. 11 hours a day, 6 days a week, harsh work, dangerous work, with so many looms and so many spindles. There was thousands of looms, thousands of spindles, and it wasn't unusual for an arm to be lost or hair to get caught in one, and terrible damage done. For some reason, they didn't settle. We do know from a baptismal cert in St. Mary's Church in Warren, that another child was born in February of the following year, 1884, February 1884. So that means that my great-grandmother was actually pregnant when she left Ireland. By the end of that year, they have left. There's no record of them in the 1885 census of that area. They have left and come back to Ireland. We don't know exactly why. The folklore story, or the family story, is that my great-grandfather heard a voice in the kitchen one night and that prompted him to go. It's more likely that they weren't doing as well as they had hoped to do, that word home from in Ireland was telling them that things were a little bit better, because I think the harvest for 1884 was better than it had been before they left. And the weather was poor in America at that stage, and I think there was a bit of a downturn as well. So they probably decided they weren't settling, they were going to go back. Documentation tells us as well that they arrived in Cove, and my great-grandmother and now 7 children ended up in the workhouse in Cove. My great-grandfather is not recorded in that information. He obviously came on a different ship or went straight to Mayo to set up a place for them. So my great-grandmother and the 7 children spent 6 months in the workhouse in Cork. Documentation tells us that 3 of the younger children were in very poor condition when they arrived, so obviously they were not thriving in Warren, despite the best efforts of Mr. Tuke. In fact, Margaret, 7 or 8-year-old, contracted phthisis, which is a type of TB, and she died in the workhouse and is buried in a mass grave somewhere. We have not been able to record where she has been buried. But by April of the following year, 1885, they have returned to Mayo. Our great-grandfather obviously got some place for them to live. They settled there. Emigration was still part of their life. They went back and forward to Scotland or to England, but they basically stayed there. My grandmother married, my mother was born, and then our family was born. The legacy for us as regards Tuke, I would think, is enormous. The more I've read about him, heard about him, took part in the conferences, that he was quite an exceptional man. Certainly a good man, a man who did good by the Irish people, who spent so many years of his life looking after them. I'm very grateful to what he gave my family in that short period of time. It may have been short, but it gave them a time able to realise or get over the difficulties they were experiencing before they were in a position to come back to Ireland again. Mr. Tuke did not want any praise for what he did, but certainly he did help thousands of families on the western seaboard to find a new life, and connections with other descendants in America has proven that.
And so the Tuke emigrants on both sides of the border, in Canada, in America, have come back to Ireland to remember their roots and to honour the great James Hack Tuke.
Stallion de mor oskin mogare. When to herim, when to hearim, when to yalloch yals miriamim, when to no cree aviolor muclevim, gusas rewore matis, gurwen to tiem.